So welcome everybody to my Growth and Profits Club workshop on Scrum, subtitled How to Do Twice as Much Work in Half the Time. Scrum has its origins in the software industry. About 15 years ago, a guy called Jeff Sutherland invented it. And its starting off point is the Toyota production system approach, continuous improvement, that sort of thing. And that's where it comes, it builds on that. Project management used to be all about what I will call the waterfall method. That is line by line, all predetermined before the project starts and difficult to change in the middle of the project. So it's a linear process and it's mapped out beforehand, often on a Gantt chart. Whereas Scrum has a project cycle of either 1 or 2 weeks. And I recommend for probably the kind of projects that you're going to be dealing with and I deal with, a week's enough. What it means is you set an objective for 1 week's development. At the end of that week, you take stock. You have a look where you are, what you've achieved and where you need to go next in the next sprint. So that it's much more self-controlling and much more efficient and leads to huge increases in productivity, according to the guy who invented it. And it's a bit like comparing your best team and your worst team and looking at that performance difference and closing the gap. So 4 or 5 times the productivity. It's all about agility, flexibility, and accountability. And the analogy that Jeff gives in his book is the book. And we have an overall story, which usually you map out before you start the book, but the work happens in the individual chapters and the chapters come together to make the book. So that's a visual of the waterfall method, where you look at the requirements, you design, you develop, you test, you verify, and then you put it into work and just maintain it and keep it, develop it further. A linear process. The Scrum process, and forgive the lack of, it's a bit blurred, this photograph, I'm afraid. But the Scrum process is not linear. You can see that from this diagram. And top left, we're looking at vision, which is what we're going to achieve. The user stories are answering the questions like, as a manager, I want information so that I can improve what I do. I can improve results. So it's I want, and so that are the stories that come out of that and drive it. The sprint backlog is all the things we need to do. Don't ask me why it's called backlog. The sprint cycle is 1 or 2 weeks. And the retrospective is a review of what we achieved in the last cycle. So that's an introduction to the way it works. That's another visual, which is more simple and is a little easier to read. So I'll put it in. So characteristics of the best teams, because it's all about getting the best out of your team. Have a sense of purpose, autonomous or self-organizing, cross-functional and cross-departmental abilities and skills. Daily planning. They recommend a 10-minute stand-up meeting at the beginning of every day to plan out that day's work or confirm that day's work. You have a regular weekly progress review. That's assuming your cycle is a week. And regular weekly feedback, rather than waiting to the end of the project and having to pick up all the pieces at that point. That's another Scrum framework, which I quite liked, but is again a bit difficult to read. So we'll just note it, I think, and carry on. Key thing about the Scrum cycle is the questions you ask at the end. And they're things like, what have we achieved in the last sprint cycle? What are we going to do next in the next cycle? And what's stopping us? So terminology, you've heard some of these funny words. So I put a little glossary together. Backlog is what needs doing. Sprint is the team cycle, 1 or 2 weeks. A user story is filling in these blanks. So as a manager, I want information so that I can make more profit, be more efficient, whatever. To do is what we're planning to do in the next sprint. Block is what's stopping us achieving our sprint goals and what can we do about it. And retrospective is the post-sprint review. So to implement Scrum, we need a product or service owner, and that's usually somebody pretty high up in the hierarchy of the business. And in the kind of businesses we all deal with, it's probably the owner, the MD. We need a team, and that should be a small cross-ability, cross-functional team. We have the Scrum Master, which in the real world would call a facilitator. And he's there to advise on how to use the tools, not to come up with the answers. The answers are for the team. Backlog is the work to do. Sprint planning is planning the next sprint. Tip here, make the work visible. And don't forget the daily Scrum, the stand-up 10 minutes. And then you have your sprint review at the end of the 1 week team cycle. So the messages are, don't plan everything before you start. We've all seen lots of Gantt charts in our work life, but how many of them actually worked? In my experience, IT projects tend to overrun by 50%, both in time and cost. Pretty scary. And I said learn from the jungle story. And what I mean by this is, imagine you are in the middle of the jungle and all you've got is a machete and some water. There are 2 guys. One guy just hacks away, very enthusiastic, just keeps hacking and hacking and hacking. The other guy, every half day, stops, climbs a tree, has a look round to check he's going in the right direction and what obstacles to avoid. Which one do you think gets out of the jungle first? Well, of course, it's the guy who climbs the tree and has a look round. Pick a great team. Sprint, I'm told, works best when everybody's internal to the business. The problem with having external people on a team is that sometimes their priorities are different. So ideally, everybody's from the business where the team is running. Always work to eliminate waste. So use tools like the Toyota 7 wastes and the Plan, Do, Check, Act from the Toyota production system. Flexibility is key. More than ever, we're in a change or die situation. The status quo does not continue for long. And inspect, review, and adapt regularly. So my question that we're going to discuss when I switch the recording off is, could this work for you?